HBA survey for Warwickshire covers the whole area to phase 1 level, and we'll be surveying the field as well, and we'll also show you about grassland conditions assessment, which I know the Heart of England Forest is very keen on at the moment. The HBA team is administered by Warwickshire Wildlife Trust and is in partnership with Warwickshire County Council, based at the local record centre, but we're co-funded by the local authority partnership, which is the district councils, and we also obtain support and advice from National England and the Environment Agency. And the project team is Biodiversity Manager, which is Chris. You've got me as the GS and Phase 1 Survey Officer, and then we have 2 local wildlife site surveyors, and we try and train a number of conservation trainees and volunteers to aid us with carrying out a phase 1 for the entire county. The HBA was set up in 1995 to capture ecological data for all of Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull, and we're one of the only projects really to carry out a continuous phase 1 habitat survey in the whole of the country. Our phase 1 data as well informs and can help survey and designate local wildlife sites, which are essentially phase 2 surveys, which I'll go on to in a minute about how they differ between perhaps phase 1, which we'll be covering in a bit of detail today. We also carry out a lot of project work. Our phase 1 data informs a lot of reports, specifically development projects, parish plans, and county-wide development proposals. And also we produce our data in GIS mapping, which is our computer program, which is a geographical information system, which we'll show you as well a bit further on into the presentation. But a lot of our aim is, the promotion of wildlife across this area, and we do enjoy working with volunteers such as yourselves. So just to give you an introduction into habitat surveying, it originally dates back to 1970s and 80s, when the first handbook was published in 1990 by the JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Council. Now it's kind of Natural England and English Nature now, but it's really stayed the same. There's been limited revisions, but essentially the same since 1990. But what it doesn't do is take into account developments in mapping and increasing the use of GIS. Also, these processes have changed. The use of the phase 1 has changed in terms of many different counties and nature conservation organisations have come up with essentially different types of revisions of the phase 1, but essentially it is still the same for a period, because we need to keep it consistent so that we can go back and compare historic data to the data we have now. So that's why we can keep it consistent for this survey. But essentially, a phase 1 habitat survey is a rapid system to record vegetation and wildlife habitats over large areas of countryside. The habitats are classified according to dominant vegetation type. So this is, obviously you can go into a lot of detail with regarding various mosaics of habitat, but really we want to record the dominant vegetation type because it keeps it simple and enables us to classify our habitats and base a lot of analysis on that simple data. But we're simply to observe, identify and record vegetation is essentially the objective of the phase 1 survey. As I say, different types of phase 1 survey exist. You can do extended phase 1 and a preliminary economic assessment, which includes animal species, protected species. It'll also give management options, but essentially it informs development of a site. So we're kind of really just carrying out a phase 1 habitat survey regularly. Also, our phase 1, it fits in with other habitat surveys. It can inform hedgerow surveys, MVC classifications. So it really is the first initial call when you are looking at a site, to start to record the vegetation. That's where you start. So essentially the phase 1 survey is the start of surveying a site or an area of countryside. So it is really the first place to begin. Like I say, it's the longest continuous habitat survey in the country. So it's been running since 1995. We cover approximately 190,000 square hectares of the Warwickshire sub-region. And our aim is to resurvey and update the phase 1 Warwickshire survey every 5 years. Obviously, given the amount of demand on phase 1, this is quite difficult, but we managed to attain quite a good currency over the whole of Warwickshire. And obviously our project base and phase 1 surveys can help inform national planning policy and especially the NERC Act, which all have aspects of nature conservation. And as I said before, we all our phase 1 mapping we put into geographic information systems, which can inform other projects, like we said before, of habitat connectivity, living landscapes and nature recovery with networks. So a phase 1 is a very useful thing to have. It can inform, habitat management plans, and essentially in terms of, your work that you do, informing where the trees should be planted and where they shouldn't be planted. So a phase 1 is really a good place to start. This is the Heart of England Forest phase 1 mapping area. It covers 66 tetrads, which is a 2 by 2 kilometre square. And that's the kind of area we work with. And we also cover local wildlife sites in that. But what we don't do is include Warwickshire at the moment. Obviously, the Heart of England Forest does cover Warwickshire, so that's obviously an area to progress. So this is typically a phase 1 map to start. The way that we record our habitats is habitat areas. So these are essentially polygons, and these will be your field systems, your larger areas of habitat. So I'm going to take you through the habitat areas in a minute, but just from the map you can see codes relating to specific habitat types, which are, again, I'll show you later. But for example, J11 is an arable field, A112 is plantation, B4 is improved grassland, essentially grazed by cattle, and the orange components are a neutral semi-improved grassland. So already just from that map you can see that we're starting to categorize this tetrad into habitat types to inform nature conservation strategies and actually assess what we've got on site. For the purpose of this diagram, the coloured linear features are hedgerows, lines of trees, or kind of linear scrub. But for the purpose of this image, we've kind of shown them as red just to show you that kind of the field system, the hedgerows. And also what we do, this small red dot here are target notes. I'll go on to a bit of target notes later, but essentially they are a description of what you found, and they're your evidence base. For example, in terms of development, if anyone questions, well, why have you designated this parcel of land as, say, poor semi-improved grassland, you've got a target note that describes the field, gives indicator species, which we work with to determine habitat type. And basically it's your evidence base and it's your reason why you've designated something. So that's why we use target notes. But also it allows you to, perhaps if you're a bit unsure about habitat type, you can put in the target note a little bit description, just saying, well, it was poor semi-improved grassland, but it had interspersed with scrub, where you can say that in the target note and you kind of can explain your decision. But we'll go on to a bit of that later. So just to show you the wide range of habitats we have in the UK. So just to start off with, we have broadleaf semi-natural woodland. This includes your ancient woodlands and your larger broadleaf woodlands. So this is quite an important habitat in the UK. So we're always wanting to record broadleaf woodlands. And obviously another habitat you're probably familiar with is the broadleaf plantation, which is A112. And so obviously these woodland types continue. You also have coniferous semi-natural woodland. So this is perhaps an aged coniferous plantation that has gone semi-natural, as opposed to a coniferous plantation which you have there as well. And then we come down to the other woodlands. So you've got, say, mixed semi-natural. Perhaps this is natural woodland interspersed with coniferous plantation. For example, a lot of the Forestry Commission sites would be, mixed semi-natural woodland. So they're the A's, woodland types, and then it comes down to dense continuous scrub and scattered scrub, which is particularly a mosaic of habitats where you have hawthorn perhaps and blackthorn mixed with bramble and grassland. So that's a bit of your mosaic habitat. And then you've got parkland trees. So these are broadleaf scattered trees, on many of the estates across Warwickshire. That would be a key habitat. We also have ones for kind of recently changed habitats. So recently fouled woodlands. If we come across a woodland that's recently fouled. Orchard, we classify orchards, and they're an important habitat, especially in Worcestershire and Warwickshire. And these are also important habitats because they're declining. Orchards are declining nationally, and a lot of effort has been made to record these. So essentially that is another important habitat. Then we come into the orange colours, which are your grasslands. And then, as we'll talk about later with the grassland condition assessments, there's essentially 3 types of grassland, depending on pH. So you can have your acidic grasslands, your neutral grasslands, and your calcareous grasslands. And these are also dependent on the type of bedrock that you have underneath them that filtrates to the soil and gives them the characteristics. Also, we have B4, which is a habitat you will get to know, and this is improved grassland. So this is grassland heavily grazed with an application of manure at some point, and it also can be seeded for agricultural use. So that is a particular habitat that you'll get to know, and it covers that and arable farmland is the kind of most dominant habitat we have in Warwickshire. So you will get to know that one. B5 is kind of marshy grassland, which is kind of interspersed with rushes. It can be seasonally flooded or have standing water on it most of the year, and that's obviously a useful habitat, especially for wetland conservation. B6 is another dominant habitat that you'll find, and this is kind of rank grassland, so tussocky rank grassland, interspersed with particularly species like hogweed and false oak grass particularly. And this is the habitat that you'll find on a lot of verges where perhaps management is quite lacking, and it hasn't been, the grassland hasn't been grazed or cut for some period of time. And we also have quite specialist habitats, for example, continuous bracken, because bracken, in terms of aging species, we can sometimes call them neophytes, which means they've been introduced recently. But bracken, just of a little note, was introduced by the Romans as bedding for their horses. But since the Roman times, obviously, it's increased to become quite invasive. And that's always a species we like to keep an eye on. Next, you have your tall ruderal and your non-ruderal habitat. Tall ruderal is early colonizing habitats. For example, tall ruderal will be the early colonizing habitats of perhaps a local quarry, where it's obviously been quarried but then been left. You're likely to get tall ruderal habitat invading into that local quarry, particularly say rosebay willow herb. So really there are a lot of key species for each of these habitats that will enable you to determine what habitat you're looking at. We then come down to very specialised habitats, and that's kind of valley mires or sphagnum bogs. Unfortunately, we don't have many in Warwickshire, and really if you think you found one of these, you probably have to do a bit of research to determine exactly what you're looking at, and whether it is in fact one of these types of habitats. So you check those, especially if it's a rare habitat for Warwickshire, you check those on the internet and perhaps consult someone else to see if you can perhaps do a good determination of that habitat. That's followed by a swamp habitat, which is essentially reed bed, or particularly your bur reeds and your river margins, same as inundated vegetation. You've got your standing and running water, which is probably one of the easiest habitats to start to classify. And then you perhaps come into your more man-made habitats, where you've got quarry, spore heaps, mines, obviously a refuse tip you can record. And then you come to the most dominant habitat type in Warwickshire, which is arable farmland, which is J11. You have allotments, and then you have set aside, which is areas where particularly farmers have left the edge of field margins to grow a bit naturally for conservation purposes, or for game rearing for pheasants and partridge. Amenity grassland, that essentially is your football pitches or your sports pitches. Short perennial is essentially kind of almost car parks or rocky ground that becomes inundated with first, early colonizers, plant species that's quite low to the ground. Introduced scrub is generally habitat that you get on planted areas around offices or in parkland or at your local park. This is, introduced scrub that essentially has been planted. And then you get bare ground, which is, could be being worked on or up to development. And then just quickly to take you through the linear features. First of all, you can have linear scrub, which is essentially your blackthorn, possibly, that isn't managed to hedgerow, but is essentially fenced on either side. Usually you get that bordering sheep grazed fields. You can have a line of linear trees. Obviously we mark brooks, canals with standing and running water. We can mark them also as linear feature. And then you have your Indian cliff, and you have your intact hedgerows. What we mean when we say intact hedge is that it's not gappy and no livestock can get through it. So that's how we determine between intact and defunct. And we also have we add on the ethos about native species rich. Well, this is a hedgerow that has 5 or more species within it. Usually for a hedgerow survey, you do that within 30 meters. But for our purposes, we generally say a hedgerow is species rich if it has more than 5 native species within that hedge along its entire length. Hedgerow with trees is where these trees, you have specimen trees within that hedge that have grown quite large. We call it, you use the term standard. So we have standard trees within a hedge. We all mark that differently just to a normal hedge. And likewise, we have a native species rich hedge with trees. So you've got quite a varied description there to categorize your hedges. Obviously flailed would become, it would just be an intact hedge, but you could also make note of that on a target note. Likewise, we make note of fences, walls, dry ditches, earth banks, but we also make note of where a boundary has been removed. This is particularly important. If a hedgerow has been removed, we can put a timestamp on that and make note of when that boundary was removed. So that's a quick rundown of the habitats that you may encounter. So as I was saying about a target note, this is really your evidence base. This is where you put in why you've made the decision you've made. So you've recorded the habitat type, and what you want to make note of is the dominant plant species. So recording these and writing a description of these plant communities present really gives you your evidence base for your decision. You can make a detail of any noteworthy animal associations, for example, butterflies or bird species, and that really helps you show the habitat's importance. You can also make notes on the past, present, or proposed management practices. This is perhaps with stuff that you've seen in the field, or the stuff that you've heard that's going to happen to the site. This all helps us form a strategy of proposed management that we'd like to make on the site. And it also, gives us an idea of if habitats are threatened. Are they being damaged? Are they, occurring naturally, or are they, developing into succession? So it really does help us if you know any changes. And also you can make reference to any previous surveys. So you can give, a bit of continuity to the survey by saying, well, this is how it's changed since the previous survey. So target notes are really useful, and they're really helpful for someone who wants to do some phase 1 habitat surveying to actually provide a transparent, process to their decisions. I don't know, hopefully we can try and bring in Chris now.
The second part of this presentation was about grassland condition assessments. HBA have been asked by Heart of England to look at a series of fields they are in the process of either restoring from arable to grassland, or old existing meadows, and trying to improve them. So we've been asked to look at these grasslands and to create a baseline assessment of how these meadows are currently looking. And so the basic sort of starting point is to use what we're level stewardship farm environment plan, or the FEP manual. And it gives a pretty simple, straightforward, step-by-step guide on how to assess a grassland. So the first thing you need to know is, well, what type of grassland are we looking at? And then we look at the species occurrence to see what sorts of grasses and wildflowers are present on the site. And then the next thing we look for is to actually count up the number of positive and negative plant indicators, and then measure variables such as cover and sward height. The typical types of grassland, we're looking for a modified or improved. They could be neutral, calcareous, acid, wet, or dry. And so we've got here an example from the FEP manual of a lowland calcareous grassland. And as you can see, we've got a description of the type of grassland that a calcareous is. So it's typically found in chalk and limestone. And then it's a list of wildflower indicator species which favor this type of grassland. And then the next column down is the measure of how many species are abundant, that indicates how good this grassland is, and does it qualify as a BAP habitat, which is a priority habitat. And then finally, you get the typical grasses that are associated with this grassland. And you get this for different types of grasslands. So for neutral grasslands, you'll have a list of wildflowers that are indicative of that type of grassland. Again, it will have a species abundance, and then a list of the types of grassland that would favor neutral grassland. So the occurrence is, it shows the quantity, if you like, the number of species available on that site. And the idea of the walkover is to have a walkover assessment of so many steps into the grassland area in a sort of a grid system. And you walk across and you count the number of plants at each stop, and you record the number of stops that you've done. And essentially you add that up, and it starts to build up a picture of what's there in terms of the amount, the frequency that plant occurs, how dominant it is, whether it's very occasional or very rare. And the species is rare if it occurs in only 1 or 2 stops in this example. So 2 or less in 10 stops, it's quite rare. 3 or 4 stops, it's occasional, frequent, you're looking at 5 or more. And you just carry on doing this through this sequence. What you're also looking for in terms of abundance is, well, what is the proportion of positive and negative plants on the sward? So obviously your positives will be your wildflowers, sedges and rushes are included. You won't include your grasses. And then the negative examples are the fairly obvious things, the undesirables, or what they call the injurious weeds, so the creeping thistle, bramble, docks. And that gives an estimate of the sort of issues that you might have in that grassland. So in terms of managing, you want to try and reduce the number of negatives. You want to try and increase the number of positives. And the more you increase the positives, the greater the biodiversity, the better the grassland is. So when we're talking about the different types of grassland, what you're looking at is how poor it is in terms of biodiversity. So if it's a modified grassland, an example of, agricultural reversal where a former ploughed field, a cultivated field is being restored, as is the case in some of Heart of England's projects that we're looking at. And you need to start to see, well, what is the existing situation and how can we improve it through regular management? And then you're looking at the balance between the positives and the negatives and how you can reduce one and increase the other through regular proper management. And that's what they're trying to achieve with this progress. Sward height gives you an estimate of the dominance of certain types of grasses, which can cause shading or creating thatch that prevents the wildflowers from establishing. And typically your coarser grasses are things like the cocksfoot, false-oak grass, Yorkshire fog, and so on. And they can dominate the sward and shade out the wildflowers. So the aim is to try and reduce the dominance of these types of grasses by regular cutting, seasonally cutting, seasonally grazing, that type of activity. And then areas of bare ground or patchiness is also an indicator of poor grassland. And as you might expect in an arable reversal, there is going to be quite a lot of bare ground. So what you want to try and look at is how that bare ground is going to be reduced through either reseeding or allowing plants to get more established across the ground. So again, you're creating this baseline that you can then use to see how you're progressing. Okay, so this is an example last year of grassland that I was looking at for Heart of England. Either side, it's the replanting that's been going on. So this is just a base grassland that we've been asked to look at. And I'll show you some of the results of looking at this grassland. This is a map of the grassland area. There's the two grasslands here. And these are the stopping points that recordings were made. And this included the diversity, the height and swards, etc. So each point it's logged, so you can see where the issues are happening, how consistent the grassland is. So that's a map of the location of the site with the grid references. And then the next slide is the condition assessment example, which is the result of the walkover survey. So on the right side, you can see the average height, percentage of wildflower coverage, the grass coverage estimate, any rushes and sedges, as there's bare ground. Litter is just thatch that can prevent seeds, wildflower seeds, from actually settling on the ground, getting in touch with bare ground. any scrub encroachment. And then at the bottom, you can see there's the dominant, abundant, frequent, occasional. So dominant if a species occurs in 17 stops or more, abundant 13 to 16, frequent 9 to 12, occasional 5 to 6, and rare 1 to 4. And then the other columns show the different types of species. So just looking down, you can see the wildflower indicator species and what occurred across that sward. So bird's foot trefoil occurred in 13 stops, so we marked that as abundant, which is a good thing. Common knapweed, 20 stops, so it's quite dominant in the sward. That's a good indicator. And then as you go down the scale, you can see we've got some red clover, which is fine, ribwort plantain, some self-hill, quite a lot of that is abundant. So these are good indicators showing what's present in the grassland and how frequently they're occurring. And then we looked at the same for grasslands. So we picked out the types of grassland that were dominant across the sward or the site. So as you can see, there's smooth brome, various bromes, quite rare. Common bent was rare. Most dominant seems to be Yorkshire fog. Fescues, they were most frequent. In fact, they were dominant, and so on. So you start to build up a picture of how the grassland is looking. And then final column is the undesirables. If you've got issues with particular types of injurious weeds. So you can see from there, the problem is with ragwort, a problem, 17 stops, that's frequent. Other than that, not a lot going on there. You got some docks, fairly standard, frequent. White clover, you get a lot of that in arable reversal, so that becomes a dominant species. So you try and keep the amount of white clover down because it doesn't really count as a wildflower. Similar creeping buttercup, it doesn't really give much to the actual positive indicator count, although it is counted as wildflowers. So that's the result of doing the walkover survey. So the next example I've got is the field survey. So the field survey is the actual practical action of going out into the field. So when we do that, we start going through this checklist of materials and things that we need to take out into the field. So this is just what we recommend for our phase 1 volunteers. We will provide you with some maps. You'll need to bring your own clipboard, pens, drink and food, and any maps you'd like to bring with you. Recommend the hand lens. You can take some pictures. Make sure you have suitable clothing. Mobile phone is normally for people going out on their own and doing their own surveys. And quite importantly, a plant ID guide. So just a quick word about plant identification books. So there's a whole range of guides available. There's a lot of material to help you out. The wildflower key is the one I tend to take out into the field with on my surveys. As you can see, it's quite well used. At the other end, the extreme end, is the Clive Stace, which is the kind of Bible for all wildflower plant identification in the British Isles. Very good, but it's quite technical. So it's maybe not one for the beginners. And then there are various floras. There's one of Warwickshire wildflowers. I know Worcestershire have produced their own flora guide. So there's plenty out there to use. So there's the basic guide that the Field Studies Council produces the common grasses. That's 30 grasses in different types of habitats. Good for introduction to grasslands and how to identify them. They also produce some slightly more advanced versions. So this is the guide to identification using vegetative characters. So when things aren't in flower, you might need to check the leaf structure and the rooting, etc. So there's plenty of material out there to use, take advantage of. Next one is just some additional references that you can have a look at. So we've got a Warwickshire Flora group. I'm sure there's one for Worcestershire as well. They do regular field visits. Like all things, it's practice, and more practice to get skilled at doing plant identification. So it's worthwhile going out in groups with people that are knowledgeable in plant identification, just to practice and learn from them. Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, they do volunteer activities. We do plant identification sessions with volunteers and members of the public through Warwickshire Wildlife Trust. And again, Worcestershire Wildlife Trust will do the same. BSBI is the go-to standard for plant identification. They have their own website, as do Plant Life, who are very active in promoting wildflowers through things like their wild verges management and that type of thing. And as I mentioned, the Field Studies Council, who produce a lot of material as well as doing practical training. And there's a quiz you can practice your plant ID quizzes on.